What if the deepest silence in history is not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of an entire world that once spoke and is no longer remembered? What if, beneath the roots of every forest and beneath the floor of every ocean, there rests the outline of something that thought and built and reached, and then was gone? These are not questions asked to disturb the night. They are questions the night itself seems to ask, when the mind slows and the small noises of the room begin to sound like footsteps in another century. Before this journey drifts further into the quiet, take a moment. If the tone of this channel offers something you value, the slow unravelling of history's unanswered rooms, leave a small mark of it. A gentle tap on the like, a subscription to keep this candle lit for the nights ahead. And if it feels welcome, share where in the world you're listening from and what hour has folded around you. There is something strange and comforting about knowing that others, in cities whose names may not even survive the next few millennia, are drifting through the same question at the same time. The question, on its surface, sounds almost like a game. Could an advanced civilization have vanished from Earth without leaving a single trace? Not a lost tribe, not a forgotten kingdom, not a city buried under jungle vines. Something larger, something whose disappearance would have to be so complete that no ruin, no bone, no tool, no line of writing survived. It sounds impossible until one begins to consider how young the modern human story truly is, and how vast the darkness behind it stretches. The Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. Complex life has been visible on land for around 400 million of those years. In that immense corridor of time, anatomically modern humans have existed for perhaps 300,000 years, and what might reasonably be called industrial civilization has existed for something like 300. 300 years pressed against 400 million. A single grain of sand held against a beach. And yet, when the story of Earth is told, that grain occupies almost the entire narrative. Everything before it becomes prologue, background, a slow warm-up for the arrival of a species that decided, without argument, that it was the first to think. The unease this arithmetic produces is what led two scientists, a climate modeler and an astrophysicist, to publish in 2018 a paper in a peer-reviewed journal of astrobiology. They did not claim that another civilization had existed before humans. They claimed something quieter, and in some ways more disturbing. They asked in careful academic language whether one could exist and be undetectable, whether the geological record which humans read with such confidence is actually capable of holding the fingerprint of an ancient industry across tens of millions of years. Their conclusion, cautiously worded and offered as a thought experiment, was that it might not be, that an entire technological society could have risen, matured, exhausted itself, and passed beneath the crust of the planet, and that the crust would keep its secret without effort. They gave this idea a name borrowed, half in irony, from an old television series about reptilian beings said to have ruled the world before mammals, the Silurian Hypothesis. The name was a joke, or at least a wink. The thought behind it was not. There is something in the human mind that recoils from this question. It is not merely a scientific problem, it feels almost like a personal insult. To imagine that another kind of being, something that walked upright, or perhaps did not, something that built and dreamed and wrote, could have lived through millions of years of Earth's story and left this world with less mark than a single fossilized footprint, is to reduce the entire epic of humanity to a chapter that might not even be the second one, let alone the first. It suggests that civilizations, like species, may simply be things that happen. that they may bloom and vanish on a rhythm the planet has learned to absorb the way a forest absorbs a fallen tree. And yet, when one looks at what remains of ancient human civilizations, the ones that lie only 3,000 or 4,000 years behind us, the discomfort deepens. The great libraries of Nineveh and Alexandria are ash. The palaces of Knossos survive only because the earth swallowed them long enough to preserve their outlines. The names of Sumerian kings are known now only because clay tablets were, by accident, hardened in the very fires meant to destroy the buildings that housed them. If 4,000 years is enough to reduce entire empires to fragmented rumour, what does one imagine 4 million years could do? What does one imagine 400? The imagination begins to falter. It tries to place a city in that distance and cannot. The concrete crumbles, the steel rusts to nothing, the glass returns to sand, and even the outlines of the roads dissolve into sediment. Continents drift. Ocean floors rise and become mountains. The place where a capital once stood may not even exist as land anymore. It may be a ridge somewhere under the Pacific, its geometry lost in a fold of stone that no one will ever cut open. If such a thing happened once, or twice, or many times, how would anyone know? The answer, at first glance, is that they would find something. A shard, a bone, a pattern in the rock. But the shard would have to survive not thousands but millions of years, and it would have to be found, and it would have to be recognized as artificial. Each of these three conditions is fragile. Together they are nearly impossible, and so the question opens and does not close. It sits there in the dark, patient as the question itself is old. It does not ask for belief. It asks only for the possibility that the human story is not the whole story. That underneath the visible past, there may be a past that never made it into any book because there was no one left to write it. The mind, having entertained the possibility, turns naturally toward the machinery that would erase such a world. And here begins one of the strangest confrontations a curious person can have with the planet they live on. The Earth, it turns out, is not a passive keeper of memory. It is an editor. A slow, thorough, unsentimental editor that revises its own surface again and again, discarding what does not survive its geometry. Consider what a fossil actually is. It is not a preserved body. It is a whisper of a body, an echo cast in mineral, made only when the conditions of death and burial align with an almost improbable precision. A creature must die in the right kind of sediment. It must be covered quickly enough that scavengers do not scatter it, and slowly enough that the bones are not crushed. It must escape the acids of groundwater. It must lie undisturbed for the tens of thousands of years it takes for minerals to seep through its structure and replace, atom by atom, the memory of what it was. And then, at the end of all that, it must be uncovered by erosion, or by the pick of a curious hand, before another movement of the crust folds it back into the depths. The odds of any single creature becoming a fossil are, by the most generous estimates, less than 1 in a million. For soft-bodied organisms, less than 1 in a billion. The vast majority of creatures that have ever lived leave no record at all. This is not a flaw in the fossil record. It is the fossil record's defining condition. What we know of ancient life is what happened to be lucky. What we do not know is everything else. There is a strange thought here. Whole species may have flourished for tens of millions of years and left nothing detectable. Entire branches of the tree of life may have grown and fallen without leaving a leaf pressed into stone. The dinosaurs, so vivid in the imagination, are known from perhaps a few thousand near-complete skeletons across a span of over 160 million years. If one were to spread that record across time, it would come to something like 1 skeleton per 50,000 years. That is what we mean when we say we know what the dinosaurs were like. We are reading a novel that has lost every page but a few, and we are reading them as if they told the whole story. Now imagine a species less numerous than the dinosaurs, and shorter lived. Imagine a civilization whose population was, at its height, comparable to the human population today, but whose duration on Earth was measured not in tens of millions of years, but in a few thousand, or a few tens of thousands. Compress that against the fossil record's already merciless filter, and the chance of any single individual leaving a preserved trace becomes almost mathematical zero. And even if one did, the chance of that trace being recognized as belonging to a thinking creature, rather than being catalogued as an anatomical curiosity of some overlooked branch, is lower still. This is only the beginning of the erasure. Above the graveyard of bones sits another force, one that operates on a longer, slower rhythm, and one that is even less merciful. It is called the rock cycle. The Earth's surface is not stable. The continents are not sitting still, nor is the seafloor. Plates slide over one another, ridges push up new stone, subduction zones swallow old stone back into the mantle where it melts and forgets its origin. The average lifespan of oceanic crust is about 200 million years. After that it returns to fluid rock. Continental crust survives longer, but even it is constantly worn down, uplifted, folded, and rewritten. There is almost nothing at the surface of the Earth today that has been at the surface for very long. The oldest exposed rocks on the planet, parts of the Canadian Shield, some formations in Western Australia, are around 4 billion years old, but they have not been sitting quietly in the open air for that time. They have been buried, exhumed, buried again, eroded, and moved. The vast majority of the Earth's surface today is younger than the age of the dinosaurs. Continental terrain more than a few million years old, undisturbed and unweathered, is astonishingly rare. The oldest surface soil, in a stable stretch of the Negev desert, has been dated to just over 1 million years, and even that is considered an outlier. On geological timescales, 1 million years is barely yesterday. What this means, in the quiet arithmetic of it, is that if a civilization existed 100 million years ago and built a great city on what was then a stable continental plain, the plain itself no longer exists. It has been ground down, buried, uplifted somewhere else, dragged into a subduction zone or slid beneath a sea. The city, whatever it was made of, has been rearranged into geology. Even its outline is gone. Even the layer of pollution it might have left in the atmosphere would show up now only as a faint chemical anomaly in some sediment core, indistinguishable at first glance from a volcanic event or an ocean current shift. And this leads to something almost vertiginous. The evidence that would prove the Silurian hypothesis true is precisely the kind of evidence the Earth is best at destroying. If one wanted to design a planet that would forget its own past, one could hardly improve on this one. Water erodes, wind carves, tectonics recycles, life itself digests and reprocesses. The very fact that Earth is a living planet, restless, moving, breathing, is what makes it such a poor archivist. There is a paradox tucked into this observation. The more habitable a world is, the less well it remembers. A dead planet like Mars or the Moon preserves its past almost perfectly. Craters from 4 billion years ago sit undisturbed on the lunar surface. If a civilization had left a monument on the Moon 100 million years ago, it would still be there, dust-covered, but intact. But Earth, so generous with life, is stingy with memory. It gives and it erases. It nurtures and it forgets. And in that forgetting, one begins to see the shape of a question that has no easy flaw beneath it. If the planet is capable of losing this much, this thoroughly, how much has it already lost that no one has thought to look for? What lies beneath the layers no one has read, folded into stone that has not yet been split? The soil underfoot is not the ground of the past. It is only what remains after the past has been sifted, again and again, into silence. There is an unsettling exercise the mind can perform, and it begins by turning the question inward. Instead of asking what remains of a civilization that might have existed 100 million years ago, one asks what would remain of this civilization, the one whose lights are on right now, if it were to disappear tomorrow and no one were to look for it until 100 million years had passed. The answer, when honestly reached, is a kind of quiet horror. Almost nothing would survive in a form that could be recognized as ours. Consider a city as it stands. Skyscrapers of steel and glass, freeways of concrete, tunnels lined with rebar, ports crowded with ships. It feels permanent. It feels like a thing built to outlast anything, but steel corrodes into iron oxide within a few centuries when left unattended. Concrete without maintenance cracks and crumbles within 1,000 years, its aggregate returning to the sand it came from. Glass shatters and slowly dissolves. Wood is gone in decades. Plastics, which seem so indestructible in the short view, break down over tens of thousands of years into progressively smaller fragments until they become indistinguishable from natural sediment. Within a few thousand years of abandonment, a city becomes a mound. Within 100,000 it becomes a soil horizon. Within 1,000,000 it becomes a smudge in the rock, if that. There have been careful studies of this. Books have been written about a world without humans, and the timeline they describe is sobering. Bridges collapse within centuries, subways flood and become caves, skyscrapers, robbed of climate control, fill with water and freeze and thaw until their steel skeletons buckle. Nuclear power plants, if not carefully decommissioned, would eventually breach containment, but even those catastrophic sites would, over millions of years, weather down into localized geochemical anomalies. The wildfires in the seas would do the rest. The great works of the modern age would not endure. They would not even come close. And yet a civilization does leave certain signatures that outlast its buildings. This is where the thought experiment becomes strange. The two scientists who first framed the Silurian Hypothesis pointed out that the surest markers of an industrial society are not its monuments but its waste. The tools decay, the pollution lingers. Carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels changes the isotopic composition of the atmosphere in a way that is recorded in sea sediments and in the shells of small marine organisms. Nitrogen compounds from industrial agriculture leave their fingerprints in soil layers. Rare earth elements, mined in unusual concentrations and dispersed into the environment, create geochemical anomalies where none should exist. Plastics, though they degrade, produce a stratigraphic layer of microscopic fragments that will be identifiable, at least for a while, as unnatural. Radioactive isotopes from nuclear tests and reactors produce a signature so distinct that geologists have already used it to propose the beginning of a new geological epoch. All of these signatures exist. All of them are at this moment being pressed into the rock record. But how long do they last? This is the question the Silurian paper turned over and over with a kind of patient dread. The answer, discouragingly, is that most of them fade within a few million years. The isotopic anomalies are diluted and smeared by ocean mixing. The plastics eventually break down beyond recognition. The rare earths are cycled back through geological processes. Only the longest-lived radioactive isotopes, plutonium-244, with a half-life of around 80 million years, would persist as unambiguous evidence, and even those in traces small enough to be missed by any but the most targeted search. So a civilization that existed and vanished at, say, the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene 66 million years ago would today leave almost nothing distinguishable from natural processes. Its cities would be gone. Its pollution would have merged into the ordinary noise of ancient atmospheric chemistry. Its plastics would be indistinguishable smears. Its radioisotopes would be present but dilute, buried among the natural background. The evidence would exist, but no one would know to look for it, and if they did, they would struggle to prove that what they found was not simply the aftermath of a volcanic eruption or an ocean anoxic event. This is what makes the Silurian hypothesis so disquieting. It does not require one to believe that such a civilization existed. It requires only that one honestly consider what the evidence for its existence would look like, and then confront the fact that the evidence, if it existed, would probably be dismissed. It would be catalogued as an anomaly. It would be filed away in a paper about ocean chemistry or paleoclimate or unusual sedimentation, and it would join the thousands of small unexplained features in the geological record that scientists shrug at and move on from. There are, in fact, such anomalies. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, an event 56 million years ago, saw a sudden and dramatic spike in global temperature, accompanied by a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere. The carbon isotopes shifted in a way that looks eerily similar to what human industrial activity is doing now. The event lasted around 200,000 years, warmed the planet by several degrees, and reshaped ecosystems across the globe. Its cause is still debated. The leading candidates are volcanic activity, methane release from ocean sediments, or comet impact. But the scientists who wrote the Silurian paper noted, with careful understatement, that the isotopic signature of that event is not entirely different from what a short-lived industrial civilization would leave behind. They were not saying that a civilization caused it. They were saying only that, if one had, the evidence would look approximately like what is already there. This is where the thought experiment reveals its cruelest edge. It is not that the past hides its secrets. It is that the past presents its evidence in a form that looks indistinguishable from ordinary geology, and there is no way, from within the record itself, to tell the difference. A civilization would look like a climate event. A great city would look like an odd layer of enriched sediment. A cultural collapse would look like a mass extinction. Everything can be explained by natural causes, because everything can also be produced by natural causes. And this is the reason a civilization could vanish without a trace, not because the trace does not exist, but because the trace has no signature that separates it from the noise. The mind returns in this reflection to its own moment, to the concrete beneath the streets, the wires strung across the horizon, the invisible chemistry of the atmosphere. All of it feels so present, so inescapable. And yet, in the geological register, it will look no different from a strange anomaly at the boundary of some future age. An anomaly that might, if it is noticed at all, be shrugged at by whatever mind is left to notice. If the geological record is capable of hiding a civilization across tens of millions of years, then the more troubling question becomes this: how much closer to the present might a hidden rupture lie? How recent in the corridor of deep time could a civilization have vanished and still leave the modern world with only fragments too small to interpret? The answer, according to a growing body of contested research, may not lie in the Cretaceous or the Cambrian at all. It may lie astonishingly close. It may lie at the edge of the human story itself. There is a boundary in the geological record, thin as a whisper and dark as ash. that has troubled scientists for more than 50 years. It appears in sediment layers across 4 continents, in lake beds, peat bogs, ocean cores, and archaeological sites. It is called the Younger Dryas boundary layer, and in some places it is known simply as the Black Mat. It dates to around 12,800 years ago, a moment at which the Earth, having emerged slowly from the grip of the last ice age, suddenly plunged back into cold. The climate reversed within a single human lifetime. Glaciers regrew, sea levels stalled, forests died back, and across large parts of North America, an entire megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, dire wolves, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, disappeared. So did a distinct human culture known as the Clovis people, whose finely worked stone points had spread across the continent, and whose presence ends in the archaeological record with an abruptness that has never been fully explained. The mainstream interpretation, until recently, was that the Younger Dryas was caused by the disruption of ocean circulation, as meltwater from the retreating ice sheets flooded the North Atlantic. This is a plausible explanation and probably part of the truth. But in the last 2 decades, a different hypothesis has gained ground among a growing number of geologists and physicists, and it points to something more violent. Within that black mat layer, scientists have found microscopic spherules of melted silica, nanodiamonds that form only under extreme heat and pressure, high concentrations of iridium and platinum, and other markers that closely resemble the signature of a cosmic impact. The proposed cause is a fragmented comet, striking the northern ice sheet in multiple pieces, releasing energy comparable to millions of nuclear weapons detonating in the atmosphere and on the ground. The theory is not accepted by all researchers. It is contested vigorously in academic journals. But the evidence continues to accumulate, and the sites where the anomaly has been detected now number in the dozens, spread across the globe. Whatever caused the Younger Dryas, something strange happened at that moment. The Earth was struck or scorched or drowned or all 3, and whatever it was, it happened at precisely the point in the human story when the archaeological record begins to feel as though a page has been torn out. Before the Younger Dryas, humans had lived through the entirety of the last ice age. They had built shelters, made tools, painted caves, buried their dead with ornaments and flowers. They had spread across every continent except Antarctica. They had, if the more radical dating of certain sites is accepted, begun to gather in surprisingly large numbers at surprisingly organized places. And then the Younger Dryas fell across the world, and something in the human story broke. When it resumed, the ice had retreated for good. The megafauna were mostly gone, and something new was beginning. Within a few thousand years, agriculture appeared. Within a few thousand more, cities appeared. Writing appeared. Metallurgy appeared. Empires appeared. The pace of change accelerated to a rate that has no precedent in any earlier stretch of the human record. This is where the discomfort begins. The mainstream story treats this acceleration as a natural progression, the inevitable result of humans stumbling upon domesticable grains and settling down. But the more one looks at the actual archaeology, the stranger the timing becomes. It is as if humanity, having passed through some vast dark room, emerged on the other side with a memory it could not quite explain, and set about rebuilding something it did not entirely know it had lost. The idea of a global reset, the notion that human civilization, or something very like it, had reached an advanced stage before the Younger Dryas and was largely destroyed by it, is not a claim any serious researcher would present as proven. It is presented at most as a possibility, but it is a possibility that fits the shape of the evidence with unsettling precision. It explains why the megafauna died. It explains why the Clovis culture ended. It explains why the earliest civilizations of the Near East and the Americas seem to arise, in the millennia that follow, with such a strong sense of remembering a lost time. It explains the flood myths that appear in almost every culture on Earth, with details too specific and too geographically distributed to be coincidence. It explains the persistent stories, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, of a golden age before the Great Destruction, of gods who came from the water and taught agriculture and astronomy and the working of stone. None of these stories on their own prove anything. Taken together, they form a pattern that is difficult to look away from. Something happened around the end of the last ice age, something that killed a great deal of what had lived through the previous 40,000 years. Something that reshaped the human story so profoundly that it is still legible in the myths that emerged in its wake. And here the imagination returns to the question at the heart of the Silurian Hypothesis, but tightens it. It is one thing to ask whether a civilization could have vanished 100 million years ago. It is another to ask whether one could have vanished 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years is not deep time. 12,000 years is a heartbeat. If something advanced had existed before the Younger Dryas, if it had built cities on coastlines that no longer exist because the sea has since risen more than 100 meters, if it had left records in materials that do not survive fire and flood, would there be a way to know? Or would the black mat layer itself be the trace, the thin dark line where whatever came before ends, and whatever came after begins with a new alphabet, a new architecture, a new memory made almost from scratch? The mind lingers on that line in the sediment. It is real. It is documented. It is present in ice cores and lake beds and cave floors across the planet, and it marks the end of something, though what precisely ended is still not agreed. Only the ash agrees. The ash is patient, and the ash remembers what was burned. To stand at the edge of the Anatolian plateau at dawn, when the light has not yet found the low hills, is to look across a landscape that seems perfectly ordinary. Golden grass, limestone outcrops, sheep grazing where their ancestors have grazed for 10,000 years. And beneath the surface of one of those low hills, invisible to any traveller until the last decades of the 20th century, there lies a temple. Not a village, not a hut, not a scattering of hearths, but a temple, older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than the first known city by more than 6,000 years. It is called Göbekli Tepe, and its discovery has quietly overturned a story that had been told with confidence for more than 100 years. The story that once seemed settled was simple. Humans lived as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years, in small mobile bands, and only after they had discovered agriculture did they begin to settle in one place, accumulate resources, develop specialized labor, and eventually construct monumental architecture. Farming came first, then villages, then temples. This progression was so widely accepted that it was rarely questioned. It was, in a sense, the foundation myth of civilization itself. The idea that a civilization must rise on the shoulders of farming was so intuitive that it hardened into doctrine. Göbekli Tepe has quietly shattered that doctrine. The site, first properly investigated in the mid-1990s by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, consists of a series of great stone circles, each formed by massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them standing more than 5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons. The pillars are carved with images of animals and abstract symbols: foxes, snakes, scorpions, cranes, wild boars, aurochs, human hands and belts and articles of clothing that suggest the pillars themselves may represent stylized figures, perhaps ancestors or gods. The workmanship is precise. The alignments are careful, the scale is monumental, and the dating is what makes it almost unbearable to contemplate. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe have been dated to around 9,600 years before the Common Era, which places them at approximately 11,600 years before the present. That is more than 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, more than 7,000 years older than the earliest pyramids. It is older than the invention of writing by 6,000 years, older than the domestication of wheat and barley by more than 1,000, older than the wheel, older than the plough. It is, in every meaningful sense, older than civilization itself, at least as civilization was previously defined, and yet it was built, it was designed, it was quarried, transported, erected, and decorated by a people who, according to the accepted timeline, should have been incapable of such an undertaking. The question this raises is not merely one of dating. It is a question about the nature of human capability itself. If people at the very edge of the last ice age, without agriculture, without cities, without a writing system, without any of the supposed prerequisites of monumental construction, could organize the labor of hundreds or thousands and coordinate the quarrying and carving of megalithic stones on a scale that rivals anything from the classical world, then what does that say about what came before them? Because Göbekli Tepe is not a first attempt. It is not clumsy. It is not the fumbling of a species discovering for the first time that stone can be carved and lifted. It is confident. It is polished. It is the work of people who knew what they were doing. And this is where the site begins to unsettle those who study it most closely. Skill of that order does not appear in a single generation. Technique of that precision is not invented by people who have never seen anything like it. There must have been a tradition behind it. There must have been teachers, and teachers of teachers, and quarrying methods refined across generations, and an artistic vocabulary developed over centuries. Where did that tradition come from? Where are the earlier, cruder attempts that should precede such mastery? They are not there. The archaeological layers below Göbekli Tepe show no gradual approach to monumental construction. The temple simply appears, fully formed, at the top of the hill. Klaus Schmidt, before his death, offered an interpretation that made his colleagues uncomfortable. He suggested that the site had not been built by settled farmers because the surrounding region shows no evidence of farming at that period. It had been built by hunter-gatherers, and this reversed the arrow of causation. It suggested that the temple came first and agriculture followed, that people gathered in numbers large enough to require a permanent food source in order to serve the temple, not the other way around. That the first great human collective effort was not the field but the shrine. That civilization, whatever it is, may have been born from something other than hunger. There is more. The site was, at some point around 10,000 years ago, deliberately buried. The stone circles were filled in with rubble and soil, carefully packed, and the temple was hidden beneath an artificial hill. This burial was not the result of neglect or slow collapse. It was intentional. Someone, at some point, chose to hide Göbekli Tepe from the world. Why they did so is unknown. Some suggest that the temple's purpose had ended. Others suggest that the burial itself was a ritual act. But the fact remains that a people capable of building it were also, for reasons that no one has recovered, capable of choosing to erase it. And they nearly succeeded. For 11,000 years, no one knew it was there. The mind, considering this, begins to see the outlines of a larger and darker question. If a monument of that scale, built by people at the supposed dawn of the human capacity for such work, could be deliberately buried and forgotten for 11 millennia, then how many others might lie beneath other low hills, other quiet valleys, other stretches of scrubland that no one has yet thought to survey? the technology to detect buried structures, ground-penetrating radar, satellite thermal imaging, LiDAR is only decades old, and it has already begun to reveal in nearly every region where it has been applied that the human past is more crowded than anyone had guessed. Cities in the Amazon that were dismissed as impossible, fortresses beneath the sands of the Arabian Peninsula, field systems and roads in Mesoamerica that vanished entirely into jungle within a few generations of abandonment. Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly, it is a warning. It is the first sentence of a chapter that no one has yet learned to read. There is a strangeness that reveals itself only when the stories of distant peoples are laid gently side by side. Peoples who never met, peoples separated by oceans they could not cross, by mountain ranges they never traversed, by tens of thousands of years of independent development. And yet, when their oldest memories are compared, a pattern emerges that no serious scholar has been able to fully dismiss. It is the pattern of the flood. Almost every ancient culture, on almost every continent, preserves a memory of a great deluge. Not merely a bad flood, not merely a river that overflowed its banks. A flood that covered the land, that ended the world as it had been known, that reset the human story and left only a small number of survivors to begin again. The details vary, the narrative structure does not. There is always a warning. There is always a chosen survivor or a small family. There is always a vessel of some kind, an ark, a raft, a hollow reed, a great gourd. There is always water rising until the mountains disappear, and there is always at the end a landing, a promise, a resumption of ordinary time in a world that has been washed clean of what came before. The Mesopotamian version is one of the oldest known. On clay tablets recovered from the buried libraries of Nineveh, the Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the story of Utnapishtim, a man warned by the god Ea of a coming destruction, instructed to build a great vessel, to gather the seed of every living thing, and to endure while the gods drown the world. The tablet, dated to the 7th century before the Common Era, is itself a copy of a much older tradition. Earlier versions of the same story appear in the Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, dated to more than 4,000 years ago, and in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, which may be older still. The Hebrew story of Noah, which most of the modern world knows through the book of Genesis, is a later inheritor of this same tradition, refined by centuries of retelling, but recognizably descended from the Mesopotamian original. If the pattern ended there, it would be unremarkable. Cultures that share a region tend to share stories, but the pattern does not end there. In Greece, there is the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, warned by Prometheus, sailing across the flood in a wooden chest and repopulating the world by casting stones behind them. In India, the Matsya Purana preserves the story of Manu, warned by the god Vishnu in the form of a fish, guided across the deluge by a great horned creature, and left to begin the age that follows. In China, the myth of the sage King Yu the Great tells of a flood that lasted for generations, tamed only by the digging of channels and the moving of mountains. In the Americas, before any contact with European traders, the Aztec preserved the story of the fourth son destroyed by water, with a single couple surviving in a hollow tree. The Maya spoke of a flood that ended the previous world. The Inca traditions of Peru recount the drowning of nearly all humanity, with survivors emerging from the mountains after the waters receded. Even further, among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, whose ancestors had been separated from the rest of humanity for perhaps 60,000 years, there are dreamtime stories of the great flood that swallowed the coasts and forced the people inland. The traditional academic response to this pattern is that floods are common human experiences and that stories of local inundation are naturally magnified over generations. This explanation is comforting but incomplete. It cannot account for the specific structural repetitions across cultures that had no known contact. It cannot account for the shared insistence that this was not simply a flood but the flood, an event of such magnitude that it defined the boundary between one world and another. It cannot account for the geographic breadth, from Australia to the Americas, from northern Europe to sub-Saharan Africa, from the Arctic to Polynesia. And it cannot account for the timing, because when the stories are dated by their internal references and by the archaeological contexts in which they were first recorded, they tend to cluster around the end of the last ice age, or shortly thereafter. The end of the last ice age was, in fact, a time of extraordinary flooding. As the great ice sheets melted, sea levels rose by more than 120 metres over the course of a few thousand years. Coastlines that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years disappeared. Entire regions that once supported human habitation went beneath the sea. The Persian Gulf, which had been a fertile river valley during the Ice Age, filled and became an ocean. The North Sea, once a plain called Doggerland where hunters had walked and left their tools, drowned entirely, and now lies beneath cold water where trawlers occasionally bring up mammoth bones and human spearheads in their nets. The Black Sea, according to a contested but persistent theory, may have flooded catastrophically when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus and poured into what had been a smaller freshwater lake, submerging thousands of square kilometres of inhabited land within perhaps a single year. If any of these events was witnessed and remembered, and it is difficult to imagine that they were not, then the memory of the flood is not myth, it is history. History remembered in the only form available to peoples without writing, story, passed down through generations, refined and stylized until it became myth, but preserving at its core the shape of a real event. And here the question grows sharper. If the flood myths preserve the memory of the drowning of the Ice Age coastlines, then they preserve the memory of a world that no longer exists, a world whose shorelines are now beneath the sea, a world where large populations may have lived along coastal plains that are now dark and submerged. What did those coastal peoples build? What did they know? What did they lose when the water came? These are not questions the archaeological record on land can answer. The evidence, if it exists, lies beneath the continental shelves, in the drowned river valleys and the sunken plains, where almost no one has yet looked. There is something ancient and grieving in this convergence of story. It is as if humanity, spread across every corner of the world, remembers the same lost mother. It is as if the shape of a great sorrow has been carried in the shared human mind for so long that it can no longer be traced to any single origin, only felt, only whispered in the same language, in tongues that have not spoken to each other for hundreds of centuries, and yet somehow agree. There are moments in the study of the past when a single object arrives, unbidden, into the hands of the modern world and refuses to fit. It does not belong to the century that made the objects around it. It does not belong to the century that came after. It belongs, by every measure of what it does and how it does it, to a future that had not yet happened. And this creates a problem the mind is not entirely prepared to hold. The object sits on the desk of the researcher and does not care about the timeline. It simply is what it is, and what it is should not exist. In 1900, off the coast of a small Greek island called Antikythera, a group of sponge divers took shelter from a storm and, while waiting for the weather to change, dived into the shallows and discovered a shipwreck. The wreck was ancient, from around the 1st century before the Common Era, and it was filled with treasures being transported most likely from Rhodes or Pergamon toward Rome. Statues of bronze and marble, amphorae of wine, coins, jewellery, the kind of cargo a wealthy Roman patron might have commissioned to decorate a villa. Divers over the following months brought up piece after piece, and the finds were shipped to Athens, where they were catalogued and put on display. Among them was a small corroded lump of bronze that appeared to be a broken fragment of some kind of mechanism. It sat unnoticed in a museum drawer for nearly 2 years before anyone thought to look at it closely. When they finally did, the lump revealed itself to be something impossible. Beneath the corrosion there were gears, dozens of them, precisely cut, precisely fitted, arranged in configurations that no scholar of ancient technology could immediately identify. The gears were made of bronze, and the teeth were triangular, and the mechanism appeared to have been driven by a hand crank. It took most of the 20th century, and eventually the application of high-resolution X-ray tomography and computed imaging, to understand what the fragment had once been. What it had once been was a mechanical computer, an analog computer powered by the turn of a handle, capable of calculating the position of the sun and moon in the sky, of predicting eclipses decades in advance, of tracking the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, of modelling the motion of the visible planets. Some researchers believe it may have also been capable of representing the epicyclic motion of the planets in a way that would not be theoretically formalised in the West for another 15 centuries. The device is now called the Antikythera Mechanism. It is dated to around the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era, and it has no known ancestors and no known descendants. There is nothing else like it from the ancient world. There is nothing approaching its complexity again for more than 1,000 years, when the first mechanical astronomical clocks began to appear in medieval Europe, and those were considered miraculous in their own time and drew the wonder of kings. The problem this creates is not a small one. Complex mechanisms of that sophistication do not appear in isolation. They require a tradition. They require workshops, apprentices, generations of accumulated technique, standards of measurement, material science, and a demand from wealthy patrons willing to fund their creation. A single Antikythera mechanism implies that there were dozens of others, perhaps hundreds, made across the ancient Mediterranean, and that the knowledge of how to make them was widespread enough to constitute a genuine engineering culture. And yet no other example has ever been recovered. Not one gear, not one shaft, not one description in the surviving literature that matches what the mechanism could actually do. There are hints. Cicero, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, mentions a device made by the philosopher Archimedes, brought back to Rome after the sack of Syracuse, that could model the motion of the planets. Cicero describes it as a marvel. He is not describing something he witnessed personally, but something he had heard about. If Cicero is to be believed, then the tradition existed, at least in his memory, and Archimedes belonged to it. But Archimedes died in 212 before the Common Era, and the mechanism found on the seabed off Antikythera was made more than a century later. Between them lies a silence, filled with nothing but rumour. Where did the knowledge come from? Where did it go? These are not questions the mainstream history of technology is comfortable asking. The mainstream view is that the Antikythera mechanism was a brilliant one-off, or a member of a small elite tradition that happened not to survive. But when one looks at the sophistication of the gearing, the precision of the calculations it can perform, the way it embodies not merely mathematics but a physical modelling of the cosmos itself, the explanation begins to feel thin. Something is missing, something has been lost, and this is where the mind, restless, begins to reach for the larger pattern. If a single object could survive from a tradition of ancient precision engineering that has otherwise vanished entirely, how many other traditions might have vanished without leaving even a single object behind? The Antikythera Mechanism was preserved by an accident. A storm at sea, a shipwreck, a burial in silt that kept the bronze from being melted down for reuse. Had it not been for those accidents, the mechanism would have been recycled long ago, its bronze poured into weapons or cookware or coinage, its gears vanishing into the ordinary flow of matter. And the ancient world, in the histories that would have been written, would have been remembered as a world that did not know how to build such things, which is in fact how it was remembered for 2,000 years, until the divers returned and refused to allow the memory to stand. This is what makes the mechanism so unsettling. It is not merely that it exists, it is that it is a proof, in bronze, of how easily a technology can be lost, of how thoroughly a civilization can forget what it once knew, of how the surviving record of the past is not a summary of what happened, but a sampling of what happened to be preserved. And the sampling is small, painfully small. If bronze gears from 2,000 years ago barely survived, what did not survive from 4,000 years ago? From 10,000? From 12? What machines? What instruments? What patient work of hand and mind was made and used and forgotten, so completely that no rumour of it reached the age of writing, and no fragment of it reached the age of investigation? The mechanism sits in its museum case in Athens, and its silence is the silence of an entire lineage of makers whose names will never be recovered. There is a strange comfort in believing that the map of the world is complete, that the continents have been walked, the coastlines charted, the ruins catalogued, the mountain ranges climbed, and it is true, in a shallow sense, that the visible surface of the earth has been surveyed. But the visible surface is only a fraction of the earth's inhabitable past. The larger fraction lies beneath the sea. It has lain there, quiet and unwitnessed, for more than 10,000 years. And what may still exist within that submerged half is a question the mainstream sciences have only recently begun to take seriously. At the height of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. This was not a small difference. It transformed the geography of the entire planet. The continental shelves, those broad, shallow underwater plains that fringe the modern coastline, were dry land. They were, in many cases, the most fertile and habitable land of that era. Rivers flowed across them, forests grew on them, animals grazed on them, and people, wherever people had spread, would have found them among the most attractive places to live. Coastal plains have always been the preferred habitat of human settlements, for the same reasons they remain preferred today: access to fresh water where rivers meet the sea, access to marine resources, access to trade along the shore. Whatever human populations existed during the Ice Age would have concentrated, in significant numbers, on land that is now beneath the sea. Then, over a period of a few thousand years, the ice melted and the water rose. Not gradually, in a single smooth motion, but in a series of accelerating pulses. The most dramatic of these, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,500 years ago and raised sea levels by as much as 20 meters within 4 centuries. That is fast enough to be perceived within a human lifetime, fast enough to force migration, fast enough to drown coastal settlements not gradually, over generations, but suddenly, within the memory of the people who fled them. And after 1A there were others, Meltwater Pulse 1B, Meltwater Pulse 1C. Each one a rise of several meters over centuries, each one erasing another band of coastal land, each one pushing the shoreline further inland. The land lost during this process was enormous. Estimates vary, but the total area of habitable land that went beneath the sea between the height of the Ice Age and the modern shoreline is at least 10 million square kilometres. That is larger than modern China, larger than the United States, larger than the whole of Europe. And this land, before it was submerged, would have contained whatever those coastal Ice Age populations had built: their villages, their harbours, their fields, their monuments, if they had any. All of it now lies under water, in most cases under sediment, in most cases in places no one has thought to search. There are, however, places where someone did think to search, and what has been found there has raised uncomfortable questions. Off the coast of the small Japanese island of Yonaguni, at a depth of around 25 metres, there is a structure that has divided marine archaeologists for more than 3 decades. It was discovered in 1986 by a local diver looking for hammerhead sharks. Instead of sharks, he found what appeared to be a great terraced formation of stone, with straight edges, right angles, flat platforms, and what looked like a set of steps rising from the seabed. The formation is roughly 150 metres long. It has features that some geologists interpret as natural, produced by the fracturing of layered sandstone along regular faults. It has other features: a face-like carving, a set of parallel channels, a possible arch, that some archaeologists find impossible to explain by natural processes alone. The debate about Yonaguni has not resolved. It probably will not resolve. But whichever side one favours, the site has drawn attention to a broader fact. The seabed around Yonaguni was dry land during the last Ice Age. Whatever the formation is, it was not underwater when it took its current shape. If it was made or modified by human hands, then those hands worked in a period at least 10,000 years ago, before the sea rose to swallow the coastline. Yonaguni is not alone. Off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, in shallow water no more than 5 metres deep, there lies a formation known as the Bimini Road. It consists of a straight line of large limestone blocks, roughly rectangular, running for about 800 metres along the seabed. The mainstream geological interpretation is that the blocks are a natural beach rock formation that has fractured along regular joints. A minority of researchers argue that the regularity of the blocks and the presence of what appear to be smaller-shaped stones fitted between the larger ones suggests something more than natural. As with Yonaguni, the debate has not been resolved. As with Yonaguni, the site was dry land during the last Ice Age. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, an unexpected discovery was made in 2001 during a routine pollution survey. Sonar imaging revealed what appeared to be the outlines of a large settlement at a depth of around 40 metres. Rectangular structures, arranged in what looked like a grid, extended for several kilometres along the seabed. Dredging brought up pieces of wood, pottery, and stone artefacts, some of which were radiocarbon dated to approximately 9,500 years ago. If the dating is correct, and it has been vigorously disputed, then the site would predate every known city on land by at least 4,000 years. Some Indian researchers have argued that this is precisely what the ancient texts of their tradition describe, in the flooded cities of Dvaraka and the drowned kingdoms of the coastal past. Mainstream archaeology, in the West, has largely declined to engage. The pattern that begins to emerge when these submerged features are considered together is not a proof of anything. It is a question. It is the question of whether the story of civilization, told entirely from the evidence of dry land, is missing its opening chapters. Because dry land, during the Ice Age, was not where most people would have preferred to live. Dry land was the marginal country, the interior, the highlands, the deserts. The best land was on the coast, and the coast is now underwater, and the underwater world has been almost entirely ignored by the archaeologists who write the story. There is something strange in the thought that the true prologue of human civilization may not be lost in the sense of being destroyed. It may only be lost in the sense of being wet, waiting, undisturbed on the shelf beneath the waves, where the light does not reach and the sonar has not yet been pointed. The sea keeps what it takes. Whether anyone will one day retrieve it is another question entirely. Among all the objects the past has sent forward to the present, few are as quietly disturbing as an old map that seems to know what it should not know. A map is a peculiar kind of artifact. It is not merely a picture. It is a claim about geography, an assertion of knowledge, a distillation of what its maker or its maker's sources had observed of the world. And when a map depicts a place that had not yet been discovered, or a coastline that could not have been visible in the sera it was drawn, the mind is forced into an uncomfortable position. Either the map is a coincidence, a lucky guess, an artifact of imagination, or the map is the last surviving copy of something much older, made by someone who had been there. The most famous example of this problem hangs in fragments in a museum in Istanbul. It is called the Piri Reis map, and it was drawn in the year 1513 by an Ottoman admiral of the same name, using, as he freely admitted in a note on the parchment itself, at least 20 older maps as his sources. Some of these sources, he said, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. Others were more recent charts obtained from Portuguese and Spanish navigators, including, according to some interpretations, a map made by Christopher Columbus. Piri Reis assembled these sources into a single composite chart of the known world, and he preserved, in the process, features that have puzzled cartographers for more than a century. The map shows the coast of West Africa, with a precision that fits reasonably well with what 15th century sailors would have known. It shows the eastern coast of South America, which had been sighted only recently at the time of drawing, with fair accuracy. What has caused the most argument and the most speculation is what appears at the bottom of the surviving fragment. There is a coastline that runs along the southern edge of the map. It is drawn with detail and confidence. It appears to represent the northern coast of Antarctica. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. It was not systematically explored until the 20th century. Its coastline was not fully charted until well into the era of aerial survey. And yet the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, appears to depict a coastline in that region, and to depict it in a way that some researchers have argued matches the underlying land contour beneath the ice, as revealed by mid-20th century seismic surveys. The claim is contested. There are cartographers who insist that the coastline at the bottom of the map is simply a stylized extension of South America, drawn in that shape because the parchment happened to end there. There are others who argue that the coastline matches the eastern edge of Antarctica too closely to be a coincidence, and that Piri Reis must have been working from a source that predated the covering of Antarctica by ice. This last possibility, which is the one that has captured the imagination of the wider public, requires that someone, at some point, mapped a coastline that has been buried under kilometres of ice for at least 6,000 years, and possibly for much longer. It requires, in other words, an ancient survey conducted by a civilization capable of ocean navigation on a global scale, at a time when the mainstream chronology says no such civilization existed. The Piri Reis map is not alone in provoking this discomfort. There is another chart drawn by the French geographer Philippe Buache in 1739 that appears to show the entirety of Antarctica divided into two large land masses separated by a channel of water. This division was unknown to 18th century geographers. It was unknown to anyone until the 1950s, when seismic surveys under the ice revealed that Antarctica does, in fact, consist of two separate continental blocks joined by a thick layer of ice. If the ice were to melt, the underlying geography would resemble Boachi's map with disturbing accuracy. Boachi himself claimed to have based his chart on much older sources, which he did not identify. Those sources, if they existed, have not been found. There are other maps of the same broad kind. The Zeno map, drawn in Venice in 1558, appears to depict Greenland with features that would only be confirmed by 19th century exploration. The Vinland map, whose authenticity is fiercely disputed, appears to show the coast of North America centuries before Columbus. The Fra Mauro map of 1459 shows features of the East African coast that its supposed European sources should not have known. Each of these can be argued about individually. Each has defenders and skeptics. But the pattern, when they are taken together, is not easily dismissed. A number of pre-modern maps appear to preserve geographic knowledge that predates their own eras, sometimes by centuries, sometimes by far more. The explanations offered by mainstream scholarship for these anomalies fall into a small number of categories. The first is coincidence, the argument that a stylized or generic coastline can, by chance, resemble a real one that was later discovered. The second is that the details are misinterpreted, that what looks like Antarctica is really something else, that what looks like an ice-free landmass is really the mapmaker's imagination. The third, more rarely offered, is that certain maps preserve knowledge from earlier navigators whose records have been lost, Phoenician perhaps, or Egyptian, or Chinese, or from cultures whose names have not survived at all. This third explanation is the one that mainstream scholarship most fears because it opens the door to a possibility no one is comfortable holding. The possibility is this: if any of the anomalous features on these maps genuinely preserve knowledge from before the era of European exploration, then someone, at some point, mapped those features. That someone had to have the ability to conduct long-distance ocean voyages, to observe coastlines with reasonable accuracy, and to record what they observed in a form that could be copied, transmitted, and eventually inherited by 15th century cartographers. Such a civilization is not attested in the historical record. If it existed, it left almost no other trace. And this is precisely the shape of the question that has been haunting the deeper corridors of this journey. A civilization capable of global navigation, whose only surviving legacy might be a few fragments of geographic knowledge inherited by later mapmakers who did not know where the knowledge had come from. The mind wants to dismiss this. The mind wants to insist that the maps are misinterpretations, coincidences, projections of modern desire onto ambiguous parchment, and perhaps they are. But the accumulation is difficult. Each map, considered alone, is defensible. The pattern of them, considered together, begins to feel like a fingerprint too consistent to be accidental. Someone knew things they should not have known. Someone drew coastlines they should not have been able to see. And the map, which does not care whether anyone believes it, sits there in its museum, inked in the certain hand of a maker who was only copying from an older source, which was only copying from an older source still, which is now gone. In the storerooms of great museums, in the back corridors that visitors never see, there are shelves and drawers containing objects that the catalogues describe with a peculiar vocabulary: anomalous, of uncertain function, attributed with reservation, purpose unclear. These are the artifacts that do not fit the tidy narrative of technological progress. They are not fakes. They are not modern forgeries. They are in most cases objects recovered from documented archaeological contexts, whose provenance is not seriously questioned. What is questioned is what they are, and how they came to be made by the people who apparently made them. One of the most persistently discussed of these objects was discovered in 1936 near the village of Kujut Rabu, just southeast of Baghdad. It consisted of a small clay jar, about 15 centimeters tall, containing a copper cylinder that had been rolled from a sheet and soldered along its seam. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod, held in place by an asphalt plug, and separated from the copper by a small gap. The jar was found in a context that dated it to sometime between the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 3rd century of the Common Era, most likely from the Parthian or early Sassanid period of Mesopotamian history. It was, by any reasonable interpretation, a battery, or at least when reconstructed and filled with a mild acidic solution such as vinegar or grape juice, it produced a small but measurable electric current. The object has been called the Baghdad Battery, and its existence has generated more argument than perhaps any other single artifact of the ancient world. The mainstream archaeological view is that it was not in fact a battery, but rather a storage vessel for sacred scrolls, and that the resemblance to a galvanic cell is coincidental. This view is defended vigorously and has considerable support. It is also, when examined closely, not entirely satisfying. The specific configuration of copper cylinder, iron rod and asphalt seal is unusual for a document container, and the presence of an electrolyte residue in some examples of similar jars has been reported, though the reports are contested. Other researchers have argued that the object was used for electroplating small pieces of jewellery, and there are Parthian-era gold-plated objects whose plating shows characteristics consistent with electrochemical deposition rather than fire gilding. Whatever it was, it exists. It sits catalogued and photographed in museum collections. It represents, at minimum, a technology of precise metalworking that the accepted history of the Parthian world does not fully account for, and it raises the same question that has begun to hover over this entire journey. If a battery, or something functionally similar to a battery, was made in ancient Mesopotamia, what did the people who made it know? Where did they learn to make it? And why is there no other record in any surviving text of what such a device might have been used for? There are other objects like this, not many, but enough to form, when they are gathered, a small and disquieting collection. In Delhi, standing in the courtyard of the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, there is an iron pillar approximately 7 meters tall, weighing more than 6 tons, cast in the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. It bears a Sanskrit inscription honouring a king of the Gupta dynasty. What makes it remarkable is not its inscription or its age, but its resistance to corrosion. For more than 1,600 years the pillar has stood exposed to the humid air of northern India, and it has not rusted. Its surface remains largely intact, protected by a thin layer of iron phosphate that appears to have formed through a process that ancient metallurgists understood but did not, or could not, describe in surviving texts. The manufacture of corrosion-resistant iron on that scale was not achieved again in any documented tradition for well over 1,000 years. The pillar's existence is not disputed. The full understanding of how it was made is still being pieced together by materials scientists. In the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, in Upper Egypt, there is a series of stone relief carvings that have puzzled Egyptologists since they were first documented in the 19th century. The reliefs depict large, elongated, bulb-shaped objects from which snake-like forms emerge, held aloft on ornate stands. Inside each bulb is what appears to be a wavy line running from a lotus-shaped base to a point near the far end. The mainstream interpretation is that these are symbolic representations of the primordial serpent emerging from the lotus at the moment of creation, a common motif in Egyptian religious iconography. This interpretation is coherent and probably correct. A minority interpretation, most prominently associated with a small number of researchers writing outside the academic mainstream, has argued that the reliefs depict something functionally similar to an early electric light, with the bulb representing a glass vessel, the wavy line a filament, and the lotus base a form of insulator. The argument has been repeated often enough that the reliefs have acquired a nickname in popular literature, the Dendera light. There is little that a responsible historian can say about the Dendera reliefs, except to note that the mainstream interpretation is likely correct, and that the alternative reading is speculative, and yet the mind, having considered the Baghdad battery, the Delhi iron pillar, and the many other unexplained metallurgical achievements of the ancient world, cannot entirely dismiss the alternative reading either. Not because it is proved, but because the sum of these objects makes it impossible to insist with full confidence that the ancient world did not know things it has not been credited with knowing. There is a particular kind of intellectual discipline required to sit with this uncertainty. It is the discipline of not overclaiming. The Baghdad battery is not proof of ancient electricity in any general sense. The Delhi iron pillar is not proof of a lost metallurgical civilization. The Dendera reliefs are not proof of ancient lighting. Each object considered in isolation admits of ordinary explanations. It is only when they're considered together, alongside the Antikythera Mechanism, alongside the anomalous maps, alongside Göbekli Tepe, alongside the submerged coastal structures, that the mind begins to feel a certain accumulating weight. Not a proof, a pressure, a suggestion, insistent and slow, that the story of the past as it is commonly told may be missing something, may be missing many things. What was the vessel for? What did the metallurgist know that he did not write down? What did the priest see when he carved the bulb into the temple wall? These are questions whose answers, if they existed, were carried in the memory of the makers themselves, and vanished when those memories vanished. The objects remain. They sit patient and dumb in their museum cases. They do not confess. They only rest there, faintly luminous with an intention that no one has yet fully translated, and no one may. The oldest lists of kings in the oldest surviving records do something that modern historians have struggled with for more than a century. They keep breaking the arithmetic of the past. They reach back into time not for hundreds of years, which would be manageable, and not for thousands, which would be strange but tolerable. They reach back for tens of thousands, and in some cases for hundreds of thousands, and in one famous case for numbers so vast that no one has ever known what to do with them. And they do this without apology, in the same matter-of-fact tone in which they describe the reign of a king whose name is otherwise well documented, whose city has been excavated, whose seal impressions have been found in the ordinary layers of the ordinary earth. The clearest and most notorious example is a clay artifact known as the Sumerian King List, whose oldest surviving copies date to the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, though the tradition they preserve is older. The list opens with a line that has haunted every scholar who has ever read it. When kingship came down from heaven, it says, kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king, and Alulim, according to the list, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The next king at another city ruled for 43,200 years, and so on for 8 antediluvian kings whose combined reigns come to 241,200 years, before the flood arrived and swept the surface of the country. Then the flood came, the list says, and after the flood swept over, kingship again descended from heaven, and here the reigns become smaller, though still enormous by modern standards. Kings reign for thousands of years, then for hundreds, then eventually for numbers that a modern reader can accept without wincing. By the time the list reaches the historically attested rulers, whose existence is corroborated by other documents and by archaeological evidence, the reign lengths have shrunk to something recognizable. The scholarly response to this list has taken several forms. The most common has been to treat the antediluvian reign lengths as symbolic, or as the products of a base 60 numerical system whose figures were meant to encode something other than literal years. There is some merit to this reading. Sumerian mathematics was sexagesimal, and certain numbers had ritual or astronomical significance. It is entirely possible that the numbers in the list were understood, by their original compilers, as meaningful in a way that did not correspond to biological time. Some researchers have suggested that the reigns represent generations, or dynastic periods, or cycles of some cosmic reckoning that has been lost, but there is a residue in the reading that does not resolve, because the list itself does not make the distinction the modern reader wants it to make. It does not separate the fabulous kings from the historical ones. It presents them as members of the same continuous tradition, in the same document, in the same tone. Alulim and Gilgamesh are members of the same list, and Gilgamesh, whom the list credits with a reign of 126 years, is not merely a mythical figure. He was a real king of Uruk, whose city has been excavated, whose walls are described in the epic that bears his name, and whose historical existence is accepted by mainstream scholarship. If Gilgamesh was real, and if the list is reliable about him, then what is one to do with the list's claims about the kings who came before him? The most honest answer is that no one entirely knows. The list preserves something. What it preserves is not clear. It may be a record of a real dynastic memory, warped and inflated by the accumulation of oral tradition. It may be a numerological composition whose surface reading is not its intended reading. It may be a fragment of a much older tradition that the Sumerians themselves inherited and did not fully understand. What it is not, according to any scholar who's studied it closely, is a straightforward fiction. It has the texture of something that meant to remember. The Sumerian pattern is not unique. Egyptian tradition preserved a similar structure. The Turin King list, a papyrus dating to the 13th century before the Common Era, records the kings of Egypt in an unbroken sequence, and before the historical dynasties begin, it lists a series of divine and semi-divine rulers whose combined reign is given as 36,620 years. The historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, gave a similar chronology, with pre-dynastic reigns totaling many tens of thousands of years, followed by the beginning of the pharaonic tradition around 3100 before the Common Era. Manetho's numbers have been dismissed as legendary, but the framework he used, of a long antediluvian age followed by a shorter historical one, is the same framework the Sumerian list uses, and the two traditions do not appear to be derived from one another. The Mesoamerican calendar traditions preserve something of the same shape. The Maya long count records dates that reach back to a starting point in 11,648 years ago, when the current cycle of the world is said to have begun. Before that, according to the same tradition, there were previous cycles, previous suns, previous worlds that were created and destroyed. The number of these prior worlds varies by source, but the framework is consistent, a series of ages, each ended by catastrophe, extending backward into a time so deep that the human mind cannot easily hold it. The Indian tradition goes furthest of all. The Yugas, the great cosmic ages of Hindu chronology, count backward not in thousands or tens of thousands, but in millions of years. The current age, the Kali Yuga, is said to have begun approximately 5,000 years ago, and to be the shortest and darkest of a cycle of 4 ages. The full cycle, one Mahayuga, is said to last 4,320,000 years and to repeat many times within a larger cosmic day. These numbers are, by every measure of modern chronology, absurd, and yet they are consistent within the tradition, defended by texts, and calculated with a precision that suggests their authors were doing something more than random invention. The mind, faced with these lists, is asked to make a choice. Either the ancient chronological traditions were Baroque fictions invented independently by cultures that did not communicate but happened to share a similar taste for enormous numbers, or they preserved, in some form, the outline of a memory of duration, a memory of ages that came before and were lost, and were remembered only as numbers that the descendants could no longer verify. The numbers may be wrong. The memory of numbers may have been. But the shape beneath them, the insistence that there was a before and that the before was vast, does not go away when the numbers are dismissed. It remains. It waits, patient as any other artifact, for a mind willing to consider what it might mean. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to those who love the past. It is the grief that visits when one considers not what the past made, but what the past could have made and has instead lost. Not lost by accident, though accidents were many. Lost by fire, lost by decree, lost by the deliberate hand of those who inherited the archives of an older world, and, for reasons that varied from theology to politics to simple contempt, decided that what those archives contained should not survive to trouble the future. And when one begins to gather these losses and to lay them side by side, a shape emerges that is difficult to ignore. It is the shape of a pattern. And the pattern begins to look, in certain lights, less like a series of unfortunate events and more like something with an intention behind it. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous of these losses. It was, at its height in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, the greatest single collection of written knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled. Estimates of its holdings vary wildly, but the most careful reconstructions suggest that at its peak it contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, drawn from every literate culture the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt could reach. Its librarians included some of the greatest minds of the Hellenistic world. It housed the collected works of the Greek playwrights, of whom only a tiny fraction survive today. It housed treatises on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, engineering, and philosophy, most of which are known now only through fragments quoted by later authors. It housed the accumulated wisdom of Egypt, of Persia, of India, of every culture whose scrolls the librarians could copy or acquire, and over the course of several centuries, through a series of fires, purges, and gradual neglect, it was almost entirely destroyed. The exact history of the library's destruction is complicated. There was no single event that ended it. There was a fire during Julius Caesar's siege of the city in 48 before the Common Era, which is often cited but which may have destroyed only a portion of the collection. There was the anti-pagan violence of the 4th century of the Common Era, during which Christian mobs, encouraged by imperial and ecclesiastical authorities, attacked the temples and philosophical schools of Alexandria and destroyed much of what remained. There was the further decay under later rulers, and finally the traditional but disputed story of the destruction of the last remnants in the 7th century. What matters is not the exact date, but the outcome. By the end of antiquity, the greatest concentration of written knowledge the ancient world had ever produced was gone. What survives to the modern world is what happened to be copied elsewhere, which is, by every honest estimate, a small fraction of what once existed. The library of Nalanda, in what is now the Indian state of Bihar, met a similar fate a millennium later. Founded in the 5th century of the Common Era, it grew into one of the great centers of Buddhist and Sanskrit learning in Asia. At its height in the 7th century, it housed perhaps 9 million manuscripts, in a complex of buildings that stretched over more than a square kilometre. It attracted students from as far as China, Korea, and Persia. It preserved not only religious texts but treatises on medicine, astronomy, logic, grammar, and every branch of learning the medieval Buddhist world considered worthy of study. In 1193 of the Common Era, it was destroyed by an army under the command of Bakhtiar Khalji, a Turkic conqueror who ordered the library burned. The fires, according to the accounts of surviving monks, burned for 3 months. What remained of Nalanda after those 3 months was a ruin. What remained of its manuscript was almost nothing. The Mesoamerican losses are stranger and in some ways more brutal. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the Maya and the Aztec possessed extensive libraries of folded bark paper books called codices, which recorded their histories, their calendars, their religious beliefs, their astronomical observations, and their genealogies. The Maya alone had produced tens of thousands of these codices over the course of their long civilization. Bishop Diego de Landa, the Spanish churchman who oversaw the region of Yucatan in the 16th century, gave the order to burn every codex his agents could find. He described the act in his own writing without apology. The books, he said, contained lies of the devil, and he had them destroyed. 4 Maya codices survive today, out of thousands. The equivalent survivals from the Aztec are only slightly better. An entire civilization's written memory of itself was reduced, by decree, to a handful of surviving pages. The pattern extends further. The Han Chinese destruction of imperial libraries during dynastic transitions, the burning of the Aztec archives at Texcoco, the systematic erasure of the Zoroastrian sacred texts during and after the Islamic conquest of Persia, the destruction of the Manichaean scriptures, the medieval Christian purges of what were labelled heretical writings, which included, among other things, most of the philosophical schools that had competed with what became orthodoxy, the Andean Quipu, the knotted string records of the Inca, which the Spanish colonial authorities banned and destroyed as instruments of pagan memory. The list is long enough that it stops feeling like a list of misfortunes and begins to feel like something else. The something else is uncomfortable to say. It is the observation that the destruction of ancient libraries and archives has consistently been carried out by the successors of the civilizations that produced them, and that the destruction has consistently followed the same pattern. A new order arises. It defines itself in opposition to what came before. It concludes that the memory of what came before is a threat, or an obscenity, or an inconvenience, and it burns. And what it does not burn, it lets moulder. And what it does not let moulder, it reinterprets so aggressively that the original meaning becomes unrecoverable. The question this raises, when one steps back from the individual cases and looks at the pattern as a whole, is a question about the nature of historical memory itself. Not merely what has been lost, but why the losing has happened so consistently, in so many different times and places, following so similar a shape. There is a difference between forgetting, which is passive, and erasing, which is not. The libraries did not merely decay, they were burned. They were burned by people who understood what they contained and who chose, for reasons they usually recorded in their own words, that it should not survive. If the past has been actively edited in this way, at every major transition in human history that we can document, then what is the record we now possess? What is history when the surviving evidence is not the residue of what happened, but the residue of what the winners of successive conflicts allowed to remain? the mind, considering this, begins to feel a chill that is not related to the temperature of the room. The chill of understanding that the story we've inherited is not the story that was written, it is what was left when the fires went out. If the archives of the last few millennia have been so thoroughly edited by human hands, then the archives of the deeper past, the ones written not in ink but in mineral, not in scrolls but in sediment, should offer a purer testimony. Stone, after all, has no theology. Rock does not choose what to remember, and yet when the geological record is examined closely, it turns out to contain anomalies that no one has quite been able to close the door on. Not proofs of anything, not evidence sufficient to overturn any established chronology, but anomalies, signatures, places in the rock where the pattern breaks and the mind, if it is honest, has to concede that something happened whose cause is not fully accounted for. The most striking of these anomalies sits in the sediment record about 56 million years ago, at the boundary between the Paleocene and the Eocene epochs. It is called the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM. It appears in ocean cores drilled from every major basin on Earth, and it appears with a consistency that leaves no doubt about its reality. Over a period of perhaps 20,000 years, the Earth's average temperature rose by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. Sea surface temperatures at the equator reached values that would be unlivable for most modern marine life. The oceans became acidic enough to dissolve carbonate shells across large portions of the seafloor. Extinctions rippled through deep sea foraminifera. The pattern of atmospheric carbon shifted dramatically, with the isotopic ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 dropping in a way that indicates a massive release of light carbon into the atmosphere, a signature consistent with the burning of biological material or the release of methane hydrates, or something else that added roughly the same amount of carbon to the atmosphere that human industrial activity has added over the last 2 centuries. The event lasted approximately 200,000 years, then slowly resolved as the Earth's carbon cycle absorbed the excess and returned to something like equilibrium. Life recovered, though it did so as a different set of species than had lived before, and the geological record, once the recovery was complete, returned to its ordinary patterns of slow change. The mainstream interpretations of the PETM cluster around a small number of natural causes. Volcanic activity in the North Atlantic associated with the opening of the ocean between Greenland and Europe may have released enough carbon dioxide to trigger the initial warming. Once warming began, methane frozen in ocean sediments could have been destabilized and released, amplifying the greenhouse effect. Some researchers have suggested a cometary impact, or a series of impacts, though the evidence for this is thinner. What all the mainstream interpretations share is the assumption that the cause was a natural one, and this is a reasonable assumption. The PETM occurred long before any species of primate had evolved, let alone any species capable of the kind of activity that could plausibly have caused such an event. But when the 2 scientists who framed the Silurian Hypothesis looked at the PETM, they did not look at it in order to argue that a civilization had caused it. They looked at it in order to ask a more disturbing question. If a civilization had caused it, would the signature look any different? The answer, when they examined it carefully, was troubling. The signature would look approximately the same. A short and sharp release of light carbon into the atmosphere, followed by a warming pulse lasting perhaps a few 100,000 years, followed by gradual recovery. That is precisely the pattern one would expect from an industrial society, burning fossil fuels over a period of a few centuries, and then either collapsing or transitioning away from carbon-based energy. The recovery time is longer than the event itself, because the Earth's carbon cycle operates on those timescales. But the shape is the same. The amount of carbon involved is roughly the same, and there is no way from within the isotopic signature alone to distinguish the two possibilities. The scientists did not argue that a civilization caused the PETM. They were careful to say that they thought it more likely that natural processes were responsible. What they did argue was that if such a civilization had existed, the PETM is roughly what its aftermath would look like, and that similar events scattered through the geological record, the ocean anoxic events of the Cretaceous, the isotopic excursions of the Triassic, the sudden extinctions at various boundaries, all fall within the range of patterns that could be produced either by natural causes or by industrial ones. There is, in the current state of geological science, no reliable test that would distinguish them. This is a strange place to arrive. It is not the discovery of evidence for a lost civilization. It is the discovery that the evidence, if it existed, would be indistinguishable from the geology we already have, which means that the geology we already have, when examined honestly, does not rule out anything. It only rules out the demand for certainty. It says only that the past is stranger than the neat sequence of natural events one might prefer to believe in, and that some of what looks natural may not be, and that no one currently has the tools to tell the difference. There are other, smaller anomalies scattered through the deep time record that have never received satisfactory explanations. There are layers of sediment in various parts of the world that contain unexpectedly high concentrations of platinum group metals, some of which have been attributed to meteor impacts and some of which have not. There are ancient bands of iron oxide whose formation processes are debated. There are unusual concentrations of certain hydrocarbons in Precambrian rock that have provoked minor controversies among geochemists. Each of these has ordinary explanations, and the ordinary explanations are probably right. But each of them is also, in principle, the kind of trace that a hypothetical ancient civilization might have left. And there is no way from within the anomaly itself to determine whether the ordinary explanation is the correct one or merely the one that fits current expectations. The mind, at this point, is asked to hold two thoughts at once. The first is that there is no serious evidence in any of these anomalies that a lost civilization existed. The second is that the tools currently available to geologists are not capable of distinguishing between a lost civilization and a natural event at the timescales in question. Both thoughts are true, and it is the second one that lingers longer, because it is not a claim about the past. It is a claim about the present. It is a claim about what the present is currently able to know and what it is not. Somewhere in the rock, if the Silurian hypothesis is even partially correct, there may be signatures that are being catalogued as natural because there is no framework in which to catalogue them otherwise. They are being read as volcanic eruptions, as ocean chemistry shifts, as episodes of climate variability. And they may be exactly those things, or they may be something else, sleeping in the sediment, awaiting a science that has not yet learned to look for it. There is question that follows, quietly and inevitably, from the observation that libraries have been burned and that archives have been edited across every transition in human memory. The question is not merely about what was lost, it is about who benefited from the losing. Because destruction on the scale that history records is rarely accidental, and it is almost never neutral. Every fire, every purge, every reinterpretation of an older tradition served someone, and when the pattern of who was served is examined across many centuries and many cultures, a certain shape begins to emerge. It is not the shape of a single conspiracy, orchestrated by a single hand. It is something more diffuse, and in some ways more troubling. It is the shape of a persistent institutional preference for a shortened past. Every established order has an interest in a certain kind of history. It has an interest in a history that begins, more or less, with itself. It has an interest in a history that presents the current arrangement of power, belief, and knowledge as the natural culmination of what came before, rather than as one contested outcome among many possible outcomes. And it has an interest in suppressing, or at least minimizing, any account of the past that would suggest that the current arrangement is contingent, recent, or vulnerable to displacement. This is not a conspiracy in the ordinary sense. It is closer to an instinct. It is what institutions do when they mature. They organize the memory of the past in ways that make their own present seem inevitable. The clearest examples of this instinct come from the great religious traditions, which have shaped historical memory more thoroughly than any other institutional force in the last 2,000 years. The Christian tradition, in its dominant forms, inherited from Judaism a chronology that began with the creation of the world only a few thousand years before the current era. This chronology was not merely a theological claim about origins, it was a claim about the total duration of the human story, and it left no room for civilizations that might have existed in the deep past. When the geological sciences began to reveal, in the 18th and 19th centuries, that the Earth was in fact billions of years old, the response of the dominant religious institutions was not immediate acceptance. It was resistance. The resistance took the form of alternative chronologies, of theological reinterpretations, and in some cases of outright rejection of the geological evidence. Even today, in significant portions of the world, a chronology based on Genesis is preferred over the chronology based on radiometric dating, and the preference is not simply doctrinal, it is defended because it protects a particular relationship between the sacred story and the observable world. The Islamic tradition inherited a similar chronology and produced similar responses when the antiquity of the Earth became scientifically apparent. The scholarly Hindu tradition, with its vast yugas, has actually had less difficulty accommodating deep time, though it has its own reasons for insisting on a particular structure of cosmic ages. The Chinese Confucian tradition tended to focus on legitimizing the current dynasty by tracing its descent from a specific, historically recent lineage of sages, and treated earlier ages as increasingly legendary the further back they went. The pattern varies in its specifics, but the underlying instinct is remarkably consistent. The institution wishes to be the culmination of the story, and the story is trimmed accordingly. The scientific institutions of the modern world are not exempt from this instinct, though they operate with different tools and different motives. The modern academic discipline of history, as it developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, established a set of methodological standards that were designed to produce reliable knowledge, but that also had the effect of drawing sharp boundaries around what counted as a legitimate object of historical study. Written records were privileged over oral traditions. Documented archaeological sites were privileged over unverified reports. Chronologies that could be cross-referenced with existing frameworks were privileged over chronologies that could not. These standards are defensible, and the discipline that they produced has been enormously productive, but they also have the effect of systematically excluding certain kinds of evidence from consideration. Oral traditions from cultures without writing, for example, are treated with a caution that can shade into dismissal. If an Aboriginal Australian tradition speaks of a coastline that no longer exists, and if geologists confirm that the coastline in question was above water 12,000 years ago before the sea rose, the tradition is treated as an interesting coincidence rather than as evidence of memory transmitted across 400 generations. If a Native American tradition describes the arrival of the ancestors from a homeland that no longer exists, the description is treated as myth rather than as historical testimony. This treatment may be methodologically correct. Oral traditions are not stable, and their content cannot always be verified. But the effect of treating them this way, systematically and consistently, is to remove from the historical record the memory of anything that happened before the invention of writing, which is to say, to remove almost everything. The archaeological establishment has its own version of this pattern. There is a phenomenon well known among researchers who have tried to publish unconventional findings, in which sites that do not fit the accepted chronology are subjected to a level of scrutiny that sites conforming to the chronology are not. Dating results that push back the arrival of humans in a region by a few thousand years are challenged more aggressively than dating results that confirm the existing timeline. Structures that appear more sophisticated than the local culture is thought to have been capable of producing are attributed to later, more advanced peoples, or reinterpreted as natural formations, or excluded from mainstream publication. This is not corruption. It is not conspiracy. It is the ordinary operation of a research community that has developed a set of expectations, and that treats deviations from those expectations with the skepticism that is heavier than the skepticism it applies to conformities. The result of all these instincts across all these institutions is a curated past, not a fabricated past, not a false past, a past that has been shaped by countless small acts of selection and dismissal into a form that fits the requirements of the institutions that maintain it. And the form it has taken is a form in which the human story is short, linear, and rising, in which civilization begins in the Neolithic and progresses, with occasional setbacks, toward the present, in which anything earlier is prehistoric, meaning outside of history, meaning not really part of the story at all. This may be the correct shape of the past. It may be that there really was no advanced civilization before the Neolithic, that the flood myths are coincidence, that Göbekli Tepe is an isolated marvel, that the Antikythera Mechanism is a lucky survival from a small tradition that happened not to persist. It may be that the anomalies collected across this journey are all, individually, explainable by ordinary means, and it may be that the shape of the past as it is currently taught is the shape it actually had. But it is also possible, and this is the possibility that will not go quietly, that the shape of the past as it is currently taught is the shape that certain institutions have needed it to have, and that the losses along the way, the burned libraries and the erased archives and the dismissed traditions, were not accidents, that they were, in some subtle and persistent way, part of the process by which the present arranges itself and secures itself against the memory of a longer story than it wishes to acknowledge. At the end of a long consideration, when the many strands have been followed as far as they will go, the mind arrives at a stillness that is not quite the same as certainty. It is closer to a kind of listening, a recognition that the questions raised across this journey do not resolve, and were perhaps never meant to, that the shape of the past, when examined honestly, is not the shape of a completed story, but the shape of a room whose walls dissolve the moment one approaches them, revealing another room beyond and another beyond that, receding into a darkness that no lantern currently made can illuminate. The Silurian Hypothesis, in its original form, was a modest thought experiment. Two scientists working in fields as different as climate modelling and astrophysics asked what evidence a lost industrial civilization would leave, and concluded that the evidence would be so subtle that current science might not recognize it if it were sitting in front of them. That was their entire claim. They did not argue that such a civilization existed. They did not offer proof of one. They offered only a mirror held up to the geological record, in which the record was asked to admit what it could not see. And the record, when it looked into that mirror, gave a strange answer. It said that the deep past is more forgiving of hidden things than anyone had previously supposed. It said that continents move, and oceans reset, and life digests, and the surfaces on which memory could have been written are being constantly rewritten. It said that even the traces one would expect to find, the isotopic anomalies and the sediment signatures, could easily be mistaken for ordinary natural events, and that no reliable test currently exists to tell the difference. It said, in other words, that the question of whether Earth has hosted more than one civilization is not a question that current science can answer with a confident no. The best that can be said is that no evidence has been found, and no evidence has been found may mean nothing at all. The mind, holding this, is asked to sit with an unfamiliar humility. The story of the past, as it has been taught in schools and museums and academic institutions across the modern world, has been presented with a confidence that the underlying evidence does not entirely support. The confidence is a product of many forces. It reflects the genuine accomplishments of the historical and archaeological sciences, which have accumulated an enormous body of reliable knowledge about what has happened in the last several thousand years. It reflects the human need for a coherent narrative, without which the present would feel unmoored. It reflects the institutional preferences of the cultures that produce the narrative, and the ways in which those cultures shape memory to fit their needs. And it reflects, at some level, a discomfort with the possibility that we are not, and may never have been, the first. To sit with the possibility that we are not the first is to sit with something that feels almost like grief. The grief is not for the lost civilization, whose reality remains unproved. The grief is for the loss of a certain kind of story, the story in which the human species is the culmination of a long ascent from unconscious matter to reflective mind, in which everything before us was preparation for us, in which the arc of the past bends toward the present. This story is comforting. It gives meaning to what would otherwise be a very cold arithmetic of deep time, in which a species may last for a few 100,000 years, and a civilization for a few thousand, and the planet forgets both within a few million. The alternative story, if it is a story at all, is more austere. It is a story in which the Earth has been a stage, and civilizations have come and gone upon it, and each in turn believed itself to be the first, and each in turn was mistaken. It is a story in which the recognizable features of the human present, the cities, the writing, the accumulation of knowledge, may have appeared before in forms that no longer survive, and may appear again in forms that will not remember us. It is a story in which the present is not the culmination of anything, but merely one bloom on a plant whose deeper structure is invisible from within any single flower. There is a way in which the question, at this point, becomes less important than what the question has done to the one who has followed it. Whether a civilization existed before the last ice age, or before the dinosaurs, or in some corridor of time so deep that no name has ever been given to it. Whether any of these possibilities is true, or whether all of them are the shadows cast by an overactive imagination. The pursuit of the question has accomplished a certain kind of work. It has loosened the grip of the shortened story. It has opened a small window in the wall of the present. And through that window, whether or not anything is actually visible, one begins to feel a draft that comes from somewhere very far away. The draft has no source that can be traced. It carries no message that can be read, but it changes something in the room. It reminds one that the walls of the present are thinner than they seem, and that the certainty with which the modern world tells its own story is a certainty that has been carefully constructed, and that could, at any moment, be replaced by a different story, better fitted to a different set of institutional needs. It reminds one that the past is not a fixed object in the corner of the mind. It is a country that is constantly being renegotiated, and the terms of the negotiation are not always visible to those who inhabit them. There is a phrase, sometimes attributed to the poets and sometimes to the philosophers, which observes that the deep past keeps its own silence, and that the silence is a kind of speech. What it says is not audible in words, it is audible only in the quality of the attention that one is willing to bring to it. Those who bring a great deal of attention hear a great deal. Those who bring less hear less. And the silence, either way, does not care. It goes on being what it is, whether or not anyone is listening. The stone, in the end, is the only witness that has been present through all of it. The stone was here before the first city, and will be here after the last one. The stone has held in its slow chemistry the fingerprints of everything that has ever touched it. The tides, the roots, the feet, the tools, the fires. Some of those fingerprints have been read, most have not. Some are legible to the sciences of the present. Most are legible only to a science that has not yet been invented, or perhaps to no science at all. Somewhere, at this moment, there is a stone that remembers something no living mind has ever known. It sits patiently, in a field or under a road or at the bottom of a sea. It does not need to be found. It has been remembering for a very long time, and the memory does not depend on being read. Whether or not anyone ever finds it, the memory is there, and the stone, in its own way, will keep it. Long after this century has become a thin layer of pale material in some sediment core drilled by whoever comes next, the stone will keep it, and that, perhaps, is the only kind of history that has ever really been.